Thank you all for being here today. It's a pleasure to see you all. We're here to talk about the crash of TWA Flight 260, 70 years later. As Rich said, my name is Terry Owen, and I'm one of the board members for the Albuquerque Historical Society. All right. So today we're going to talk about several things. And actually, I hope to take you on a journey that covers 70 years. We're going to be going by air and by land on this journey. So please ensure that your tray tables and seat backs are in the full upright position before we begin. We're going to talk about the timeline of the crash, the plane and the passengers, the crash, the search, and the recovery, some of the causes and effects. What did we learn from this experience? And we'll take a look at the crash site 70 years after this occurred. But first, there's a test. So I would like for everyone to stand, if you can, please. And at the count of 3, I would like for you to point in the direction of north. And if you're not sure which way north is, just give it your best bet, your best guess. Okay, looks like a lot of you are pointing in that direction. Okay, all right. So we'll reveal the correct answer a little later. The second test is show of hands. How many of you have been up to the TWA crash site? So quite a few of you. Yeah? All right, great. All right, we start off on Friday, February 18th, 1955. The Martin 404 that's owned and flown by Trans World Airlines, and we'll refer to as TWA. And the aircraft is referred to as the Skyliner Binghamton, begins its journey from San Francisco, and its final destination is supposed to be Baltimore. It makes an intermediate stop in Las Vegas to drop off people and to allow other people to come on board. And then it proceeds to Albuquerque Municipal Airport, what we now refer to as the Sunport, for an overnight stop and crew change and also to refuel. So on the following morning, Saturday, February 19th, the San Francisco-based air crew is replaced by an air crew based out of Kansas City. The aircraft gets refueled, and they put on, and it was hard to tell from the documentation whether their total fuel load was 1,020 gallons or if they just topped it off to a total of 1,370 gallons of 130 octane aviation fuel. And so by comparison, the fuel that you put in, if it's gasoline that you put into the tank of your vehicle, is probably around 85 to 89 octane. So highly volatile, very explosive fuel. At about 6 a.m. that morning, passengers begin arriving and checking in at the Albuquerque Municipal Airport. On the left, we have a photo of the terminal. It was built in '39, and it was active until 1965 when the new terminal was replaced it. It's still in use today. TSA uses the building now. As you can see, the passengers' waiting room is pictured on the right, and that's a circa 1950. And what many of you may notice immediately is the people are dressed up pretty nice. They're wearing suits and ties and hats, and instead of flip-flops and pajama bottoms, as we typically see today. Continuing on Saturday morning, at about 6:45 a.m., Captain Spong and his first officer, Creason, do their pre-flight checks. They note that there's heavy clouds that shroud the Sandias, and there was also a storm front to the west. An aircraft that was coming in at about the same time noted that there was a lot of snow that they encountered on their way into the airport. Flight hostess Sharon Schoening prepares the cabin for passenger boarding at about that time, and at about 6:50 a.m., the passengers begin to board the aircraft. At 6:59, the passengers are on board, the engines are started, and they're warming up. At 7 a.m., Flight 260 begins taxiing to runway 11 to get ready to take off. Little did anyone know on that flight, they just had a few minutes left until the accident. At 7:03, Captain Spong requests and receives clearance for takeoff. And at 7:05, with First Officer Creason at the flight controls, Flight 260 reaches its rotation speed of about 115 miles per hour and takes flight. The wheels are retracted to begin the 26-minute flight to Santa Fe. At 7:12, terrain warning bells sound in the cockpit, and through dense clouds, the first officer spots the sheer cliffside off of the right wing. He tries to take evasive action by pulling back on the yoke to bring the nose up, and at the same time, turn to the left as hard as he can. However, at 7:13, Flight 260's left wing strikes the cliffside of the Sandias at about 230 miles per hour. At 7:15, over the radio, Albuquerque approach control calls Flight 260, and there's no response. Flight 260 is lost with 16 souls on board, 3 crew members and 13 passengers. So this depicts the 2 tracks. One is the green track is the intended course. It goes out about 4 or 5 miles to the west after they have taken off to the south-southwest. And then they make a right-hand turn and head to the north, where they make a dogleg up around Algodones. And then they go about 15 miles or so and make another left and arrive in Santa Fe about 26 minutes later. Unfortunately, for reasons that will probably be revealed later, they actually took off, and instead of going about 4 miles before they made that right-hand turn, they only went about 1 mile. And then they made another right-hand turn, and ended up on this track and ended up in what's now referred to as TWA Canyon. The track that's in green was specifically chosen because it kept aircraft away from the mountains. So let's meet the crew and passengers. Captain Ivan Spong was born in Chanute, Kansas in 1910, started his career flying with Cessna, and then he began training with TWA in 1942 and eventually became a captain for TWA. During World War II, he was with the Air Transport Command, which was under the Army Air Force, and he undertook flights to transport all kinds of people and things to Europe. And he flew more than 100 times to and from Europe. He had flown the Albuquerque to Santa Fe route 11 times in this particular month. And previously, he'd expressed concerns about his uneasiness with that route in inclement weather. The first officer was Jesse James Creason. He was born in 25 in Dado, Arkansas, and he began his flying career after enlisting in the Army Air Corps in World War II. He was a flight engineer, a gunner, and a bombardier on B-17s. And he had over 4,000 hours of flying time after he used the GI Bill to learn to fly. He'd flown the Albuquerque to Santa Fe route over 30 times and was well acquainted with its hazards. The flight hostess was Sharon Schoening. Sharon and her twin brother were born in 1931 in Spencer, Iowa, and she moved to Kansas City for a year and a half of flight hostess training and then joined TWA. The 23-year-old was probably preparing coffee in the after end of the plane when the crash occurred. Now we'll go to the passengers that were on board that day. Homer Bray was from here in Albuquerque. He was a local insurance and real estate professional, and he was headed to Topeka, Kansas on business. Reverend Earl F. Davis was also from Albuquerque. He was pastor of the First Assembly of God Church, and he was on his way to Oklahoma City to attend his brother's funeral, who had just passed a couple of days previously. Lois Dean was also from Albuquerque. She was a farmer's daughter originally from Hollis, Oklahoma, and she became a first grade teacher at Lew Wallace Elementary. She was on her way to Oklahoma City for a job interview with the U.S. government to be able to teach military dependents in Japan. Dan Collier from Cincinnati, Ohio. He was president of Dan Cohen Shoe Company, and they had recently opened an Albuquerque location, and he was headed back to Cincinnati for his 50th birthday the following Friday. Robert B. Riley from Dallas, Texas. He was an engineer for the American Institute of Steel Construction, and he was headed home to Dallas to be rejoined with his family. Robert S. Nyland and Harry N. Schuth from Kansas City. They were professional engineers heading home to Kansas City from Las Vegas, Nevada, where they had been witnessing atomic bomb tests the previous Sunday. Mr. Alfred and Mrs. Dorothy Schoonmaker from Hackensack, New Jersey. They were visiting New Mexico for Alfred's business. The couple were planning to drive from Santa Fe to Los Alamos for a business meeting. William R. Campbell from Tenafly, New Jersey. He was 29, and he made a last-minute flight to Albuquerque, and he was going to join his father-in-law, Alfred Schoonmaker, on his Los Alamos business trip. Worth Nickel from Albuquerque. He worked for P&M here in Albuquerque, and he was flying back to Amarillo for his son's 14th birthday. Dr. Robert Bulk from Socorro. He was born in Estonia in 1899, and the New Mexico Bureau of Mines geologist was heading east to attend a National Science Foundation meeting. Lastly is Harold Tipps from Tulsa. He was vice president of Helmerich, Payne Oil and Gas Drilling and Exploratory Company. After searching land records in Santa Fe on February 18th, he was headed home to Tulsa, Oklahoma, but that flight was turned around and he boarded Flight 260 the following day. The last victim in our story is the aircraft itself. It was a Martin 404, had a crew of 3 to 4, held up to 40 passengers, just under 75 feet long, and had a wingspan of just under 94 feet. Maximum speed, 312 miles per hour, had a little over 1,000-mile range, and had a pressurized cabin, so could fly up to 29,000 feet. Its power plant was two Pratt & Whitney 18-cylinder radial engines with three-bladed 13-foot 2-inch propellers. And it was a pretty reliable aircraft. It had been involved in 5 crashes over a 19-year span, which for that era was not a terrible record. And there's a photo of the Skyliner Binghamton as it appeared. To give us a little more context, I decided to compare the Martin 404 with the Boeing 737 that is so ubiquitous flying in and out of the Sunport here. So the Martin 404, like we said, is about 75, had a length of about 75 feet, and the Boeing 737 was about twice that. Martin 404 held 40 passengers. The Boeing 737, depending on the variant, holds over 180 passengers. Now, I'm an accountant and I'm a numbers guy, and so in looking at those numbers, it made me realize with Boeing being twice as long but holding more than 4 times the number of passengers, I now understand why my knees always hit the back of the seat in front of me. I'm glad you like that. So yeah, cruising speed about 280 miles per hour for the Martin and 485 for the Boeing. And there's a photo of what the flight deck looked like. It was a fairly modern plane for the time. You know, they learned a lot during World War II in terms of controls and avionics, and the Martin 404 was a modern plane for its day. And this is what the interior looked like. Again, held about 40 passengers. So I'm going to switch to, since the crashes occurred in our story, I'm going to switch to what the search and recovery process looked like. Just to give you a little more context on what we're talking about, this is a air photo from about 1950 of Albuquerque, and I'm guessing it was the camera was somewhere like over the San Mateo area, perhaps. Looking east, and you can see Wyoming off in the distance, and then there's a lot of open space there. Of course, there was a lot of ranch land and high desert out there. Juan Tabo at that time was a dirt road, or dirt and gravel, so you know, it was not what we think of today. So, as we know, we covered the crash of the aircraft on Saturday, February 19th, but at about 8 a.m., several attempts to raise Flight 260 via radio were unfruitful, and so it was deemed to be overdue in Santa Fe. Law enforcement notified and began its organizing the search process. At about noon, the search begins. There were nearly 50 aircraft and hundreds of men combed an area 75 miles by 75 miles and beyond along both sides of the intended track. Keep in mind, there was the intended track, that was that green line that I showed you, but the red line there was a difference of between 4 and 40 miles from that intended track. So, a huge expanse of area. Helmerich and Payne Oil Company sent a company plane and personnel hoping to find Harold Tipps, their vice president. 38 research staff from New Mexico Tech arrived in 13 cars to join the search with Dr. Christina Bulk, whose husband was on the flight. 50 members of the Civil Air Patrol broke into two-person teams for ground search and fanned out to begin their search process. 400 members of the Bernalillo County Citizens Unit arrived and moved out and camped in the hills northeast and northwest of Albuquerque to search. At nightfall, all the aircraft were recalled, and only one aircraft was left up in the air to look for flares and fires. It was a really tense night that night. There were fires and flares were reported all over the region, all the way down up to Cabazon Peak, clear up into Clayton, and as well as Klein's Corners and all the surrounding mountains. Following day, on Sunday, February 20th, at about 4 a.m., searchers began assembling at the search command post, which had been set up on the north end of Juan Tabo Road. In addition to all the volunteers that I've talked about to this point, over 400 Explorer Scouts and Boy Scout executives assembled with the search leaders and law enforcement. Search parties were told to be prepared for extreme cold and heavy snow. And I checked the weather for this particular day and this period of time, and a cold front, like occasionally blows through here, was settled over Albuquerque during this week. And so the highs were around 30, and the nighttime lows were around 10. Pretty chilly. And keep in mind, up on the mountain where they're headed, the temperatures can be 10 to 20 degrees colder at elevation. So at daybreak, more than 50 aircraft begin the search, and that includes several Civil Air Patrol planes. There were 19 of those. There were 10 planes from Kirtland Air Force Base, several from Kansas City. Amarillo Air Force Base sent 3 planes. Clovis Air Force Base sent 2 planes and a helicopter. And some TWA officials from this area rented aircraft for their own use to aid in the search. About 10 a.m. on Sunday, wreckage was spotted by James Bixler. He's the chief pilot for the Carco Air Service on his way for a delivery from Albuquerque to Los Alamos. And from the Albuquerque Journal, he's quoted as saying, "I had felt the plane was in that area throughout the search, although I had flown by it not less than 15 times without seeing it. I started my last pass at about 10,500 feet and let the plane down into the cove." I don't know what he means by that terminology unless it's the mouth to the canyon. I dropped down to about 9,300 feet and gauged the wreck's altitude at about 9,000 feet, which was a pretty good guess because the aircraft rests at about 8,500 feet. I saw only the tail section. You can't see anything else from the air, and I was lucky to see it when I did. Colonel Gibson, the commander of the 44th Air Rescue Squadron from Lowry Air Force Base, took a helicopter and hovered within 50 feet of the wreckage, saying it definitely was the missing aircraft and there was no possibility anyone survived. Captain Joseph Cosgrove, likewise, in his observation said, "There's just a splotch of black. It appears the plane had blown up and blackened the surrounding rocks jet black." Because of the Sandia's topography and the way the canyons are shaped and the way they look from the ground, it took people on the ground several hours to determine exactly where the wreck site was. And so that created additional delays. Here's a photo from the Albuquerque Journal. Bob Shumway, who was one of their photographers, rode over the scene, and he's quoted as saying, "They had to make 4 passes before I could see anything, and then it was just a tiny piece of the plane's tail." You can barely make that out. If you look really closely, it's just a little shiny spot in that photograph. Sunday, February 20th, that afternoon, about 3 p.m., New Mexico State Patrolman Bill Lucas and 3 others jump into a Jeep and drive from Juan Tabo across the desert about 3 miles and begin hiking and bushwhacking their way up to the crash site, which is located at least another 3 miles and 2,000 vertical feet from where they started. And a bunch of other people join in on the search from various agencies and organizations. Because of the rough terrain, a lot of them turn around because they're fatigued or they just don't want to battle the terrain. At nightfall, the party led by Bill Lucas makes it to the crash site, and they forage for firewood to keep from freezing to death. With no bedrolls, they manage to start 2 small fires and then stand up all night and attempt to keep warm and keep the fire going. And they're quoted as saying, "Every minute seemed like hours until the daylight came." Several search parties unfamiliar with the terrain up there in the Sandias, they ended up in the wrong canyons completely. Later on Sunday, George Hankins, who's the oldest member at that time of the New Mexico Mountain Club at 57, volunteers his organization's assistance owing to their technical climbing and mountaineering experience. His offer to assist is repeatedly rejected by those in charge of the search. And he finally suggests to the New Mexico State Police that his group should approach the wreck site from the top of the crest, because we had yet to find a cliff in the Sandias that couldn't be rappelled, and we could resort to that if need be. Finally, perhaps out of frustration, the state police agree with him, and they tell him to be back at headquarters the following morning. So at 7:30 a.m., they eventually make it up to the crest, and they start hiking down from the crest road to the Kiwanis cabin, and they spot the tail section atop the pinnacle more than 1,000 vertical feet below. George Hankins, Ken Shaw, a number of other people arrive at the vicinity of the wreck site and eventually make their way to the top of the pinnacle. And here's the Albuquerque Journal photograph from February 21st, 1955. Again, you can barely make out a shiny spot on the side of the canyon. So the following day, Monday, February 21st at about 10, the team led by New Mexico Mountain Club find what are believed to be 12 bodies atop the pinnacle, and 4 more that were down below the 300-foot north face of the pinnacle buttress, making what seemed to be, what they thought, was all 16 of the bodies of those that were on board. An explosion obviously had occurred with all that aviation fuel on board, and so a lot of the wreckage was down below, down in the slopes below the impact site. Again, you can just barely make out the tail in this old photograph on the right. The photo on the left is of Charles Williams. He was one of the members that had accompanied the New Mexico Mountain Club up. And he's sitting atop the pinnacle with a lot of the crash debris. And you can see the left horizontal stabilizer and also the vertical stabilizer is jutting out over the edge of the cliff. On the right is, you can see the debris that was in the tree from the crash site. Interestingly, that tree is still there. It is full of foliage now. It's grown out. It doesn't look like it's ever been damaged. It's amazing, you know, what nature can do in 70 years. So as part of the search and recovery process, they've got to deal with all of these bodies. And most of the bodies were in a small, elongated area near the remains of the aircraft and the fuselage. Some were ejected over the north edge of the cliff by the exploding fuel tanks. Passengers and crew were subjected to extreme forces, as you can guess. The sudden deceleration from a speed of around 230 miles per hour and the impact of the crash meant that maybe luckily death was instantaneous. Many of the victims were dismembered in some way, and in some cases the bodies became frozen to the ground because it was so cold, and that hampered recovery activities to some extent. The photo is of Dr. Zerlup. He was a medical doctor with the Civil Air Patrol, and he was working with George Hankins in this photo to identify the bodies. The book that is featured over here on Cavalcade of Wings table, The Crash of Flight 260, goes into painful detail of the conditions of the bodies that they found. So they had more or less thought they had identified the locations of all the bodies, and the state police asked George Hankins of the New Mexico Mountain Club to begin devising a way to move the bodies off of the mountain. And he had no experience doing that, but he was determined to figure it out, in his words. So on Tuesday, February 22nd at about 5 a.m., New Mexico Mountain Club members and more than 40 others assemble at the Juan Tabo staging area to make the journey back up to the crest through snow and ice to hike to the crash site and begin that task. And as you can see, I've listed some of those members. There were military, New Mexico Mountain Club, several people from TWA and others. At about 9:30 a.m., the group arrived at the crash site, and they started to begin the process of developing a method utilizing ropes and climbing gear to get the bodies to an area where they could be placed into body bags and taken down the mountain. So on Tuesday, February 22nd, continued. The recovery team thought that they had located all the bodies. However, only 7 were recognizable, and that's a quote out of the Albuquerque Journal article that I've added up there. And body bags were being carried by only 6 men down the very rugged and treacherous canyon. Where are my folks from New Mexico or from Albuquerque Mountain Rescue? Raise your hand. There's a few of you in here. I can't imagine using only 6 people to do that. I think in most cases, you'll find if you're trying to extract a body, it takes 2 to 3 times the number of that number to get them down. It's really an arduous process. But they were carried down to the notch of the canyon, and then they were loaded onto horses and carried to awaiting ambulances east of Juan Tabo. And there were thousands of people assembled there just to see what was going on. So they thought they had extracted all of the bodies, gotten them down the mountain. But then on Saturday, March 5th, the post office here requests New Mexico Mountain Club members to go back up to the crash site and search for missing mail sacks, because that's how mail gets moved around, is on aircraft. So again, one of the heroes in our story, George Hankins and others, go back up to the crash site, and while searching the area, they come upon 2 more partial sets of human remains. And when they get back down, they report that to the sheriff. On Monday, March 7th, they meet with TWA and Sandia Labs personnel, and where their New Mexico Mountain Club is informed that there are actually 3 bodies that are missing and are unaccounted for, and what was delivered to the family members were only partial remains sets. So on Wednesday, March 9th, George and several others return to the crash site, and they locate the 3 missing remains. And those remains were located under debris, or they had just been difficult to see or find because of the snow and ice. They used that same process to get those bodies down. They carried them as far as they could, and then they were picked up by horses. So at that point, they thought they had everybody, but after all of the ice and snow had receded in May, on May 14th, George again returns to the crash site with a team and search for any remaining physical remains. They gathered approximately 150 pounds of remains and gave them a dignified burial upslope from the crash site. So let's talk about what the after effects were and what did we learn from this process. I think history is a lot about understanding what happened, and in those cases where there's a catastrophe or conflagration, trying to understand how we can keep it from happening again, or reduce the risk at least. So the Civil Aeronautics Board, of course, they launched an investigation to determine what the cause of the crash was. And they do that through the normal process of conducting interviews, gathering flight and tower records. They conducted a forensic examination of the aircraft's navigation equipment, components, and other activities. They almost immediately outright rejected any navigation equipment error or failure. And so on October 12th, they issue a report that says in one particular sentence, the direct course into the mountain taken by the flight was intentional. So that was interpreted by many that read that the pilots had committed suicide and essentially murdered 14 other people. So this unintentional phrasing inflicted additional anguish onto the already grieving families, as you can probably imagine. There was ample evidence by those who studied the report carefully. Of course, a lot of active pilots looked at the report, and their belief was that the report was written based upon conjecture rather than cold hard facts. And one thing that was omitted in their in CAB's investigation was the fact that the pilots had tried to perform an evasive maneuver. But that canyon is so tight, as you'll see here after a bit, that there's just no way that they could have gotten out of there. But they had tried to pull the nose up and to go to the left to get away from the cliffside on the right. And actually, it was heading somewhat northwesterly when it crashed. So there were objections lodged by a friend of Captain Spong's, TWA Captain Larry DeSelles, who he independently, on his own time and his own dime, reinvestigated the crash and provided evidence the cause was more likely than not a flux gate compass and land-based radio navigation equipment failure. So two potential things happened that were errors or failures that significantly contributed to the crash. Again, the issues with the flux gate compass had been reported on numerous occasions by other pilots and personally experienced by Captain DeSelles, and that's why he really dug into this for two reasons. One, he had experienced these problems before himself, and he knew Captain Spong was not the type of person to perform such a horrendous act. He believed that all of these issues, combined with heavy clouds and the resulting disorientation by the pilot, were deemed to be the most likely cause based upon his investigation and assessment. So, 5 years later, on June 15th, 1960, more than 5 years, as I said, after the crash, it absolved the pilots from blame for the accident, but the CAB reported that the actual cause as unresolved. So, which way is north? We seem to have a little bit of disagreement. Let's see. Who said it was that way? It's this way. That was, you did pretty good. Pretty good. But imagine if you're on a cloud-shrouded mountain and you can't see, you have no point of reference, and you only have a split second to figure out which way you need to go. That would be an impossible situation. So, again, it's about what did we learn? And there have been a lot of improvements in processes and systems and training in the interim. And pilot error is often cited in a lot of accident reports and mishaps, that it's a major contributing factor, and it's dependent upon the situation. But there have been a lot of actions taken and technology employed to reduce cognitive overload and improve emergency responses on the part of the aircrew. Of course, there have been leaps and bounds of improvements in air navigation over the last 70 years to significantly reduce the probability of navigation error. Now we have all these redundant systems on aircraft to ensure that we know what direction we're going in. Also, there's been a significant increase in pilot training and certifications and periodic recertifications by pilots. For the victims and the victims' families, at the time, New Mexico didn't have an official means of notifying next of kin of accidents or death. Family members who were waiting at the Santa Fe airport weren't told of the missing flight, and they didn't find out until they actually went to go ask someone, hey, where are my loved ones? Some families found out about the crash via their local newspaper 2 to 3 days later. And TWA made no statement and had no contact with family members post-accident, and they didn't participate in or pay for repatriating any of the remains. Families did at that time receive a death benefit of $10,000. And unfortunately, Captain Spong's family in Kansas City received numerous prank calls, harassment, and even death threats over the CAB report that made it sound like he had purposely crashed the aircraft. It got so bad that Captain Spong's wife and child had to move to Phoenix to evade their tormentors. Subsequently, there have been numerous laws that have been passed to fill some of these gaps. And of course, reputational risk to aircraft is an important aspect of holding them responsible. And obviously, tort claims that have been filed by family members, those have also changed their behavior. Whoops. Another significant change has been the search and rescue functions that we have available to us. There was a recognition that there had to be a better system for search, rescue, and recovery. That was absolutely essential. They learned a lot from this process, and they did a great job of documenting that and taking note of where they could improve. First is New Mexico Search and Rescue, or New Mexico SAR. That was founded in the aftermath of this. It's largely staffed by volunteers. And the New Mexico Search and Rescue Council was founded in 1974 as a nonprofit volunteer organization to support those efforts. In this case, the New Mexico State Police manage the SAR program within the Department of Public Safety, and there's a robust certification program for all of those volunteers. If you get into trouble, you call 911, and the search and rescue process gets activated. You or one of your loved ones make the call. And I think a really important aspect of this is that there's no cost for being rescued, because, and I know there's some debate over that, and I think the explanation for that is that it's easier to find someone who's alive and talking to you than it is to search a couple of 100,000 square miles to find a body. So they don't want cost to be a prohibitive factor of someone picking up the phone and making the call and saying, I'm in trouble. There's also the New Mexico's Mounted Search and Rescue. They were founded in 2009, and they use, they use horses and mules to search for those who are missing. New Mexico SAR responds to an average of 126 incidents per year, and this is an older, I think this number is a couple of years old, and I'm looking at Duke. I don't know if that number has increased, it's higher now. I'm not surprised. There's also Albuquerque Mountain Rescue Council. Raise your hand, Duke. He's vice president, right, of New Mexico, or excuse me, Albuquerque Mountain Rescue Council. Again, the idea of this was born out of the TWA crash, and it was formalized in November of 1955. Again, it's an all-volunteer wilderness search and rescue team, and there are rock climbers, mountaineers, backpackers, people with a lot of medical experience. I think they used to have a few doctors on board, they still do, good. And nurses and other healthcare professionals that can administer first aid. And they are an accredited member of the New Mexico Search and Rescue Council and the Mountain Rescue Council. And they work hand in hand with New Mexico SAR and the state police. And again, if you need them to come save your bacon, there's no cost for that. Although they probably would appreciate a beer. Is that right? So how do you get there? Domingo Baca Canyon or TWA Canyon tried to sort of depict where that's at. It's more or less, if you find the tram, the crash site is, let's see, about 1,000 vertical feet below that area. It's located about 8,550 feet above sea level. And again, when you're at the crash site, if you look straight up, you're looking at the tram wires, and you'll see every once in a while the tram passes overhead. It's about 3.55 miles from Elena Gallegos open space via Domingo Baca Trail. And there's 2,150 vertical feet of climbing at a 12% average grade, and there is plenty of 50% maximum grade to get your attention. And the hike is rated as strenuous or difficult. And you can get lost up there. There's a couple of turns that you need to make that if you don't know where they are, you're going to end up in a blind canyon somewhere. So this kind of shows the route from Elena Gallegos. It tends generally northeast and proceeds on up. And you hit Domingo Baca Trail and then end up almost directly below the tram wires. There's a few shots of the trail on the way up. It's fairly gentle for about 2 miles, and then the last mile or so is pretty steep. The structure on the right, I have no idea what it is. I've heard it called different things. Juan Tabot's cabin. I don't know who built it. Could have been, early settlers or some peace-loving hippies in the 1970s. I really don't know, but it's kind of a waypoint along the trail. Again, you can see, somewhat tell how steep the trail is in areas there, and a lot of rocks to climb over. And on the right, it's where it starts to get more steep, but it's a beautiful, beautiful trail. You can see this beautiful ponderosa with the golden bark on the left, and through the trees you can see what's referred to as the dragon's tooth, and when you get to that point, you know that you're within striking distance of the crash site. Again, there's a kind of a closer photo of the dragon's tooth on the left, and on the right is the entrance to the TWA crash site. When you get here, you're only a few hundred feet from the debris field. And so I'll set this in motion, I think. Whoops, sorry. So we'll carry on. We have a malfunction with the animation. So when you reach the crash site, there's some debris that you encounter, but then you reach this one area where there's been a memorial plaque attached to some of the debris, and it briefly tells the story, and then also lists the names of those who were on board when it crashed. You can see, I think this has been up there for 20 years. I think it was installed at the 50th anniversary of the crash. It's getting a little worn. There's a few of us that are talking about maybe improving that somehow, and we'll figure out what we're going to do about that. More of the debris, one of the landing gear on the left, and one of those Pratt & Whitney engines on the right. On the left is my good friend Pat Barney. Raise your hand, Pat. Pat is also, as you'll see, the drone operator for the drone shots that we have. And the other Pratt & Whitney engine there provides some amount of scale for how large that engine is. And on the right, again, more debris in the debris field. And as you may or may not know, when the tram was being built, they wanted to try to hide or obscure some of the debris, so they pushed a lot of it underneath this undercut that's on the left there, but there's still quite a bit that's scattered all around up there. So last couple of things. There's a small memorial for TWA Flight 260, and that is located there at the Albuquerque Sunport. It was in one of the conference rooms, and I'm going to look to Michael Howell, who's the chair of the Cavalcade of Wings. Are you in the process of moving that out to a more public area? The Sandia what room? Okay, thank you. And on the right, just yesterday, the Albuquerque Mountain Rescue Council made a hike up to the site and held a memorial service, and each of them carried a flag up to the crash site, and then had a few moments with the site, and then came back down. I've been up there probably at least 15 times and maybe 20, somewhere in that range. And I've been up there by myself, and I've been up there when there have been friends of mine, but also complete strangers. And the one thing that has always struck me and that I appreciated is that people treated that as like a sacred space. They treated it with respect, and I just always, I don't know, for me, I just always appreciated that. So here's the drone footage. The outcropping up and above to the right is where part of the debris was found. We're up, I don't know, probably about 250 feet above the floor of the canyon, and we're going to pan around. And if anybody gets vertigo, you might want to hide your eyes right now. But you can see it's a really beautiful canyon. And we're panning around to the right, kind of to the east, and then eventually back over to the northeast. And then we pan down, and again you can see about how high up we are. And again, it's probably around, I would guess around 200 feet from the floor of the canyon. Is anyone getting dizzy at this point? No? But it's very rugged, but also very beautiful. And this is looking more or less straight up the canyon towards the crest. Very steep. Again, you know, you're about 1,000 feet down below the crest at this point. This is the direction that the TWA Flight 260 would have come into the canyon from. So we're facing south-southwest. But as you can see, that canyon is extremely narrow. At its widest point, I would have to guess maybe 300 feet where it came in at. So again, after he got into this canyon, his fate was sealed. So lastly, these are some of the references that I went to get this information. The crash of TWA Flight 260 by Charles Williams, if you're looking to learn more about the crash, it's a great reference. It's well written. And the author was one of the people that were actually up at the crash site. I want to acknowledge Pat Barney again for being my drone operator. Thank you. And also I want to acknowledge Michael Howell of Cavalcade of Wings. He helped me out quite a bit and lend me some references. And then he also set up this great static display over here to my left, your right. Please take a look at that when you get a chance. And lastly, here's the list of those who perished that day. And as I mentioned before, when they were getting strapped into their seats, they didn't realize that in 15 minutes, things would change. And so maybe when we're talking about lessons learned, maybe think about being kind to others because you don't know where you or they are going to be in 15 minutes. So thank you very much.